So I'm William Chan and I work for Cox Architecture in Australia. We're a large multidisciplinary practice, but I very much work in both architecture and urban design. But I've been involved with the Centre for Sustainable Urban Development here for a couple of years now through different projects. Starting with Global Studio, doing that, working in informal settlements in both India and South Africa, and then more recently working on people building better cities. I work very closely with the team here and also have an affiliate role as a researcher. So very much excited in terms of what actions we might come up from this issue.
My daughter is very passionate about UN, in particular with the SDGs, and I know Geeta through her husband. We went to Russia together, and through that I became interested in Asia initiatives, and that brought me here because my daughter is very passionate about it, as well as me, and I'm willing to learn more, and that's why I'm here.
Hello, my name is Pankti Dalal and I am a student at SIPA, School of International and Foreign Affairs, and I am specializing in urban and social policy. And before this I worked in India with city governments in trying to advocate how they need to improve as an institution. Because in India, city governments are not taken so seriously, whereas so I believe city governments in the developing countries can take a forefront in addressing issues of resilience and sustainable, which they aren't. So I want to work towards advocating for it and nudging them to do so. So I'm here to learn.
I mean, when you see children that age tapping stone in the sun,
Yeah.
in the 21st century, you think, wait a second, I'm coming from a country where people are right now getting all excited about social media and how the world is getting ever more fast and fantastic. It's just this huge discrepancy of realities. You think unless we can wrap our brain around the fact that the world is more complex than we would like to see with our box thinking, we're not going to touch it.
It was one of those things that, now we've watched the entire alternate side of unbridled capitalism or whatever. And so I'd say seeing that come around, it'll be fun to kind of look at biking is one way. What's the next micromobility transport that people are using? We're finding that people of color, women, and other folks that won't even get on a bike will pick those up faster than anything else. Scooters, and then I'd say look at a lot of the studies that are out there. I think safety is still going to be an interesting thing because how fast are they going? In bike lanes, delivery drivers, they're not wearing helmets. Those are all things that we can figure out. I think it's still just getting people out of a vehicle and thinking about that, because once you get that cyclist mindset and you're damn it, I could have just been here in 10 minutes. 10 minutes. I was living down in Clinton Hill near Prospect Park when I first got here, and I was running in the park a lot, and then I would go up to Williamsburg where our office is at, and it's 20-minute bike ride, easy. But how could I get there outside of that? Take the G, I have to walk and then wait for this, and it is the worst thing in the world, but it's so fun to get that difference by taking your own personal transportation, and now it's cold, so it's a lot harder to do that, but you can figure it out.
A solar zoning access ordinance, but then when we got it pretty much passed through 3 mayors, and the 3rd mayor said, well, it's not really important. So immediately a 7-story building shot up, shadowing its whole surround. So it's difficult in South America.
I'm so glad I went there in 1976.
It's difficult everywhere.
Climate activist based here in New York City. I've been on strike every Friday for the past 49 weeks as of this Friday in solidarity with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movements. And so I'm a national and international organizer for the global climate strikes that occur. So you may have seen September 20th, where we had 315,000 people here in New York City alone. And so I'm also the founder of a nonprofit called Earth Uprising. It's a climate education nonprofit that then works on mobilizing young people to take direct action. And so I'm very excited to be here to meet some new people who are very interested in the SDGs, because for the work that I'm doing, SDG 13 just very symbolizes it all.
This is another Asia Initiatives project, which is in New York City, the New York City Housing Authority, the Polo Grounds. Everybody knows this is one of the projects where there's a lot of crime right now. There's lack of community. There's the facilities are not being used well enough. The playgrounds are empty. People are not safe. So we have recommended a two-pronged strategy to engage the community. Number one is an innovative urban design, which we are going to design the open spaces and urban spaces. The second is SOC, which Anisha was talking to earlier. The purpose is, how do we engage the community in a way where they don't feel like helpless, that somebody is coming and telling us what to do, instead of we are taking control, and the success rate is then higher. So as we go through the slides, this is what I told you, crime and all. So we can go. So this is right now what it looks like. This is one of the playgrounds, empty, nobody's there in the middle of the day. And this is what we mapped out were probably awesome spaces that we could use to reinvigorate the community, where people can come, hang out, and make it a community that everyone wants to live in with. So this is part of a site analysis. In the site analysis, we saw that there are a lot of open green spaces, but with minimal utilization, which is a shame in a place like New York City when you have so much green space and it's not being used. This one was where we can somehow make connections between these spaces and put things like rock climbing or innovative use of the playgrounds where kids could come, middle-aged kids could come, parents would come.
At the moment now I'm looking at scaling this project to beyond the European context. So working with UNICEF in Australia and been last year also working with UNICEF Innovation, their innovation team, to look at how we might scale, and they have benefactors who are also interested in future skills technology for young people. But I think for me it was also important to actually get, working with vulnerable communities is important. You don't do more harm than already exists. So it's important for me to do it where it's a child rights approach, and working with UNICEF, and they have those connections and contacts and actually understand whether or not programs like this, technologies like this is actually helpful. I don't want to be just working with community where this might not be what they need. So I think it's important to find out what they need, and this might not be transferable.
I started my own firm last year doing consulting, but I've been working for 30 years for other people in small firms and up through very large firms. And I've always done a lot of affordable housing and senior housing. And so I'm focused in my consulting practice on just working on affordable housing issues. I feel very lucky to have made that transition, and I wish I'd done it earlier.
I previously came from a world more similar to you guys. I was a civil engineer working on water and environmental services for 14 years. And I felt like I'm seeing a lot of on-the-ground work, but how do we translate that into kind of broader action? So I actually came here to Columbia to get a degree in public policy, and then made a pivot into kind of bigger picture policy discussion work, which led me to the forum. And I'm here today to meet all of you guys and everyone else in the room to see, what are the innovative projects that people are doing in urban settings to advance sustainability, and what of those initiatives and projects can be replicated and scaled to a global network to kind of advance that impact.
And since then has grown into a network of more than 550 community gardens around the 5 boroughs. And these are official city gardens, so there are a number of other gardens that are managed by different nonprofits and groups around the city. And these are spaces that now total more than 100 acres of open space and involve more than 20,000 community members who are involved in stewarding these open space areas.
And it became so popular that since then there have been over 5,000 before I die walls around the world. Each one is initiated by somebody in their community who wants to make a wall. It's very simple to make, a chalkboard wall with these prompts on it. And so it's now been in everywhere from Japan to Nigeria to Iraq to Brazil.
This project. A couple of things about New Orleans that are particularly important to this project. So a lot of New Orleans, the population is relatively young, but as you might know, the city has faced a lot of hardship in recent years. So resiliency issues, as well as blight and economic downturn on the back of that. And so a large population of the city's youth is below the poverty line, and in terms of our child-friendly research, it was quite evident that children are a really good meter in terms of city issues. They're usually the most affected. So when a natural disaster comes in, if your infrastructure is not robust enough to provide for them, they're a lot of the times the ones left out. Education, hunger, all these other overlays. So children are a really good meter in terms of how a city is operating.
A project, like how you're evaluating it. But if you kind of think about those components as integral and as measures, it can have a better result. Like you can know, we've got to do union on this component of the project, and what does that mean, right? In terms of
my name's Charlie Cunningham, and I am here from EA Creative. And with our group, we actually had a really interesting discussion around some, what kind of takeaways from, question? Yeah, what changes in cities are needed to better support strong collaborations between multiple stakeholders to ensure the success of Agenda 2030? So we got really into that conversation, and I'd say our 3 key takeaways were having metrics or measurement tools, just overall, to be able to quantify what you're doing. And it came out of a classic measure twice, cut once, and we could talk about that later. And then also just do it very early in the process, in the development process. Definitely think about things like maintenance or other things that can come in early in the process so they don't get left out by the end. And then our last one was making sure that we have an interdisciplinary team. Yeah, so making sure planners, architects, we definitely are a team of urban designers around here, and so we really got stuck in the physical environment. But I would say making sure we have an interdisciplinary team that works together on these SDGs. Great job. All right, go team 1.
Hi everybody, I'm James, and I'm here with Candy Chang, and we do a lot of participatory public art installations. We talked about a lot at our table, and there was an impressive wide range of experience and expertise at our table, ranging from dealing with issues of architecture, development, zoning, climate, economic equity, and we started to connect those different issues into this question of narrative shifting, how we tell the stories of the work that we're trying to do and to make it more vital to a broader public. Returning to this question, if you can get people to line up early in the morning for a sale for 10% off, can you use those strategies to get people to be invested in climate or education or these more vital issues, and how do you make them more pressing and urgent? We started brainstorming a lot of different possibilities. The 2 ideas that we kept returning to were these questions of how do you make it a universal question, maybe that's pegged to maybe something more emotional or universally felt, so that way you can counteract this very atomized, polarized information culture that we live in, where we tend to just kind of stay in little circles, so to reach everybody. And then secondly, to create maybe a dedicated space that feels manageable for people, because people want to be able to express themselves, they want to take action, they want to be seen, but sometimes when you're faced with some massive issue like climate, it just becomes paralyzing. So what's a small step, or maybe to encourage somebody, you're going to spend 5-10 minutes here just thinking about it in an undistracted space to start to get your head into this particular discipline or this particular question. And then we also talked about community boards, how to maybe rewire or expand their reach. And I've probably used up my minute, so that's table 2's experience. Thanks.
So we are from Table 3, and we were from representing Asia Initiatives. We presented 2 projects of using socks. One was for a NYCHA project and how we can use that as a springing board to revitalize the community, but on an urban design level, but also to engage them. And second was going through the entire sock menu of how once the community feels it's embedded in the change, its success rates are higher. We had a our table was very varied in experience, and we had a lot of talking points, but one of the points was that SDGs right now we felt very much at a higher level, like even in New York, which is such a motivated city in making sure SDGs and sustainability and all the goals are met. But how much is it really going down to the ground level? Like students or kids, do they really know what recycling is? The difference between, do we need to use, like today, for example, how much plastic did we get to waste, right? So we felt that language there has to be a big shift in pushing the language of the SDG goals to the community at the very grassroots level, so that everybody can make a change, because everybody taking a step means it's a big step.
And we also talked about how we can, there were talking points about how we can, not just look beyond the SDGs and maybe also look at the indices and also try to come up with best and worst practices, so that we can have a direction in order to address and accelerate the SDGs. And there was specific suggestions, for example, to how to make waterways, and how do you design water edges, because in cities like New York, we have this whole edge which is concretized and it has concrete, and how do you design them? You include waterways, new agricultural systems, sea agriculture, you add open spaces that could be usable, and it could be part of the education, and also in order to also inculcate a system or a feeling of biophilia among people, so that they are more connected with their environment. And that is one way that our group thought we could have more community engagement with the SDGs. Thank you.
I have the privilege of representing Table 4. So I think we had a presentation on 2 very interesting projects, which basically focused on how they reflected on community needs of refugees and children in cities, and how to integrate that into design. But the 2 actions that we came up with were basically, first, to inculcate the value of sustainable development goals within kids, because they are the future generation, something that the panel 1 already reflected on, through summer camps, to kind of inculcate this whole value of SDGs as you grow up. And the other action that we thought of as professionals, when we are designing projects, to kind of keep this filter of what your project is really ticking boxes in the SDGs, so that you can reflect and understand as to what you're doing is moving towards a larger goal that the world has agreed upon. So to kind of have this filter of what your project is doing to contribute to the SDGs. And largely with our 2 actions, we reflected on how that the whole point of the SDGs is there has to be awareness, there has to be agency ownership on part of individuals, professionals, and governments to kind of really take ownership of these SDGs and try to implement them in their own individual capacities. So thank you.
So we were group 5, 9, and 11. And we basically had 2 things we talked about. First was materials, and I think the key question was, what materials are sustainable and what materials are future materials that are not very popular right now, but should be because they are sustainable, have low CO2 footprints, and actually similar characteristics to concrete. And I think central to that was clay and hempcrete. And our discussion evolved around also the education and the training, but also the legalization, the legal aspect of those materials, because hemp, although similar to the plant that you smoke, is not quite marijuana, but it has only been legalized in the US since December. And so we talked about how there's potential in those materials and how communities should be educated on using them. And then the second thing was transportation and zoning. So we talked about how zoning and transportation influences not only how we live in cities, but also how cities produce pollution, how cities affect the environment. And I think the solutions there were more up in the air. I think that's something we will go deeper in maybe in another discussion, but yeah, that's what Group 5, 9, and 11 talked to us.
Hello, everyone. I had the pleasure to moderate a very nice group of people with diverse backgrounds, so it was very pleasant, the conversation. We discussed, particularly based on my presentation on the SDG Academy, that we create content on the SDGs, which is widely distributed and accessible for free everywhere in the world. How we could ensure that this content reaches over 1 million participants or learners, that's something that we want to do. How can we be more effective into handling this content for people that will act in terms of advancing the SDGs? So some of the ideas that we discussed were, for instance, how we can better understand our audience, right? So for instance, how surveys can help us to understand who comes to us, but also how they use the content and how particularly they act on the SDGs based on that. What the other question was kind of, trying to dig a little bit more deep, what type of content are we presenting? And for the most part, we see that we are producing these courses that are open online, massive courses on the SDGs, but then there could be opportunities to create games for children. Some people had different reactions to it. Some people love it, some people didn't like it so much, but this could be perhaps for some audience. Also how professional development courses that could provide credit specifically to professionals. That would be something that people would appreciate. They had to take courses anyways, but it would be good to have more repertoire courses on sustainable development, podcasts to bring another audience and to steer conversation on the SDGs, and overall customized content, right? Beyond the global perspective of the SDGs, how we can anchor more clearly into different realities. And then also how we could reach other constituencies. We're reaching overall a lot of universities, but also perhaps local governments or more practitioners. And how we can move more effectively from content and knowledge itself to obviously practice, and through case studies we're doing that, but also to bring more of the aspect of inspiration that can help people be mobilized and realize that these issues are really touching us and changing the way that we live, and potentially we're going to suffer very much if we don't act. So how we can help through inspiration that can be positive yet compelling, that we can all take clear action on the SDGs. So thanks to my team.
Hi, I'm Spencer Harbo from Grow NYC. I co-facilitated Table 7 with Alexandria, and we started our discussion by talking about climate activism and youth engagement, and engaging community members and community participation through initiatives like community gardens in New York City. And we moved on to talk about the fact that places like New York are maybe a leg up in terms of ecological footprint and our resource use, but have a lot of work to do in other areas like our waste management and how much we consume, and the waste that we produce. And a couple of the takeaways that we had focused mainly our discussion kind of narrowed down on mobilizing young people and engaging critically the people who are going to be our future voters and decision makers, and having increased education for overcoming things like climate denial to help meet the SDGs and accelerate the SDGs. And also just having very simple messaging for initiatives in the SDGs that people can kind of latch on to. Things like Love Mother Earth that you can engage with whether you're 7 or 70. And so how we can use kind of messaging to get people on board and to engage a larger audience. Thank you.
Well, I was given the honor to really talk about the youth climate movement and the activism that I've been doing, but then also how all of you can get involved in this current climate movement that is going on. And so first of all, my name is Alexandra Villasenor. I'm a 14-year-old climate activist here from New York City. I've been on Climate Strike every Friday for the past 49 weeks. Every Friday in front of the United Nations headquarters in solidarity with Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement. But my activism really did start before I started climate striking. I'm originally from Northern California. You can usually tell that I'm not born in New York because I either smile too much or I talk too slow. But I moved here last August, and so I was visiting family back, though, where I was born and raised in Davis, California, in November when, during Thanksgiving, when the Paradise Fire broke out. And so my hometown is very close to Paradise. We ended up receiving a lot of the smoke from that wildfire. At one point, it was 350 AQI, which is Air Quality Index, and it was the worst air quality in the world. And so since a lot of that smoke was seeping into my home, I had to roll up wet towels and put them under windows and doors. And so since it was really inflaming my asthma so much, my family had to send me back to New York City early from that trip. And of course, I was very upset because a lot of my friends and family were still in that wildfire. And if you look at California, it's still on fire. There's about 10 fires right now all throughout the state. And then just seeing, though, how it's becoming more frequent there for this to happen. The new normal is climate change in California, where students don't go to school because the air quality is so bad. And so because of that, that made me start to feel very upset. So I started to research about wildfires, and I started to see the connection between climate change. And that made me want to take some sort of action. And so that's why after seeing Greta Thunberg speak at COP24, I knew that I could really have a voice. And that's what made me start to get involved and start striking. And so after I started my climate strike, I got connected with activists all around the world. And we started to plan for the first ever global climate strike that occurred on March 15th. And on that day, 1.6 million people protested climate inaction all around the world, demanding that their world leaders acted now. But that was just the first of many actions that the youth have taken. And so after that, in New York City alone, lots of students had come together, and we started to plan for May 3rd and May 24th. Now, those 2 days are one of my favorite actions that we've taken here in New York City, because on May 3rd, we had over 1,000 students having a sit-in on the Brooklyn Bridge. Without any permission, it was a very spontaneous action. And when it comes to the youth movement, that's one thing that I find very special about us, is that we are very spontaneous. A lot of our actions are thinking outside of the box. And so with that sit-in, we were demanding that Mayor Bill de Blasio declares a New York City climate emergency. And of course he didn't, but that same day, New York City Council had drafted a climate resolution. And so with the continuous efforts on May 24th, where we had a die-in in Times Square with over 3,000 students, finally in June with the climate strikes and other efforts, we finally got a New York City climate emergency. And so seeing how the youth movement is implementing our local policies and we're really influencing governments is one thing that I find so special, but we still need to think globally. And so that is why on September 20th, if any of you were here in New York City or in your own cities, you may have seen a bunch of students striking school on the 20th. Internationally, in September, we had 7 million people striking for climate action. And what was impactful about that was it was right before the United Nations Climate Action Summit. So we were demanding that our world leaders there took action. And when after all of their failures at past summits and COPs, that's why we finally took our demands to the next level, because one of our demands is to hold polluters accountable. And so I, myself, Greta Thunberg, and 14 other children, that same day on the 23rd, filed a complaint to the Committee on the Rights of the Child stating that our rights are being violated by Argentina, Brazil, Germany, Turkey, and France for their inaction on the climate crisis. If any of you have looked at the rights of the child, Article 6 states that we have an inherent right to life. Well, with the climate crisis, when students are having to leave their homes because of floods and wildfires, when people in other countries are getting malaria 3 times a year, when we are seeing the effects right now all around the world, our rights to life are being directly threatened by the climate crisis. And so that is why we are taking it to the next level with our climate strikes and our legal actions. We are finding a way to take action in every aspect of our society. What makes the youth movement so impactful of what I've seen is that we have this morality. Fighting the climate crisis is the right thing to do. And that is why young people feel this passion, because we see how it's the right thing to do to protect our environment. And so, of course, all of you, if you haven't joined a climate strike yet, I'm here to give you some advice on how you can be an adult ally to the youth climate movement. So first of all, you can be a fan. And by that, I mean F is fund, A is amplify, and N is narrate. So when it comes to funding, in the youth climate movement, there's a lot of people who are really experiencing the effects of the climate crisis, and their voices deserve to be heard. But when it comes to being able to come speak about what's happening in their community or the actions they're taking, sometimes that creates an economic divide where those who can't really afford to go and speak about what's happening to them can't. And that's why funding is so important. And then A, amplify. When we're out there, when we're protesting, you can amplify us to people in positions of power. You can lobby your politicians. You can talk about the youth movement and connect us with those who are going to help our activism. And then N is narrate. So all of you have climate stories. You have either seen the climate crisis in your own communities, or it's affected you personally, politically. And so narrate your climate story to those who will listen, but also to those who won't. We need to be talking about the climate crisis to everyone, about what's happening in our community, because what I've seen when we talk about our personal experiences is that we really change people's opinions. If you ever come in contact with a climate denier, I have some relatives who are climate deniers. And so one thing that I found is with that personal connection that you've had and that foundation that you have, and when you talk about the climate crisis, then you can really change the conversation and people's opinions and really change it to listening to the science, because the climate crisis is not an opinion that one can have. And so that is why talking about your narrative is so important. And so I hope all of you will be a fan of the youth climate movement, and then also join our climate strikes. The next strike is on November 29th and December 6th. It is right before and in the middle of COP 25. And so this is very monumental because it's one of the times where all of our world leaders come together again. So we need to be even bigger as the climate crisis continues to get more urgent. So I hope all of you will join us. Thank you.